Good. So let's take a look at the map, right? It might actually help if we could see kind of some of the kind of reflection what it looked like before, and then what it looked like after. It might be able to help us out with that, right? So I'll connect in a second, but yeah, Britain was now in complete control. Once it shows up, you'll see. Okay, Britain was in complete control, right? The yellow is what the British territory was, and this is what it was before. You see clearly there's a difference here in how it changed, right? The French were dominating this entire area. Looking at the red, that's the French territory, right? They were dominating the New World, right? They control all the trading territories, and they put out their outposts all over there. And all of a sudden, after the war had ended, then now the British were now in control, right? What else can we say? Or else for something? Yeah, Veronica. Yeah, even though they had control, right? They clearly this is a positive for the British. They were in a lot of debt, right? And it wasn't just because of this one war. It was a culmination of all the wars that they were fighting, right? Remember that we talked about the three great wars that happened before the French Indian War. They were in like a time period of just constant war with France and Spain, like throughout the entire process of getting new colonies. So at this point, they're in a massive debt. What are some other things? Some other effects. And some of them could be even short-term effects. Some short-term effects. Yeah, Angela. Yeah, right. I think on this next slide, I talk about how the views, right, that came about because of the war were very starkly different, right? The British view of the colonists was, you guys stink. Like, you guys literally can't defend yourselves. And we literally had to carry you on our backs to survive this thing. And the colonists were like, wow, we defeated the French. We're like the best. We're the best thing since sliced bread, right? And they started thinking of themselves as being so high and mighty that they can now defend themselves against anybody. Whether it was France or Spain or even native tribes, they could do it all, right? So there's this new perception about themselves that they envelop, right? What else? Anything else you could say? Another big thing we talked about. This one's probably one of the bigger things. It's a short-term effect, and then it turns into a long-term effect, if you want to call it that. Happens on the next slide. Yeah, Rain. Yeah, Pontiac's Rebellion, right, is not the next slide, 2 slides over. Pontiac's Rebellion happens, and why does this happen? We talked about it, yeah.
Wasn't England pushing too far left, and then their tribe kept getting home favored?
It was more the colonists after the war had really ended. The colonists were like, "Oh, let's just go take over the new area that we got," and it caused a lot of resentment and a lot more tensions than they expected because the Pontiac and his group and all the different tribes that he was allied with were allied with the French. And they were basically like they weren't being interfered with. All of a sudden now they're being interfered with, and they're like, yeah, no, like we're not letting this happen. And they started not only attacking the forts that the British had taken control of, but a lot of the colonists, and the colonists couldn't defend themselves. So it ended up killing a lot of people. And then because of this, what did the British do in response? Yeah, Angela. Good. The Proclamation Line of 1763, which basically was a way of stopping the colonists from overstepping their boundaries, right? It's forcing them to stay with this red imaginary line that they cannot pass over it. And this would stop any sort of interaction with native tribes over the area, which would cause a lot of issues, right? What was one of the big things that you can take away from this, especially from the point of view from the colonists? Well, how do they feel about this? Yeah, Rainer. Yeah, it was kind of like the colonists. Remember, they had this high mighty view of themselves. Like, we just defeated the French, and then now the British were taking away the land that they had, the spoils of the victory, right? And they felt this was a complete slight against them, right? And that's a big deal. It's going to now lead to a lot of other things. Now, as Veronica had said, the fact that they were in a massive amount of debt is now going to cause a lot of issues. So let's jump into that now. So this is now new material. I might have mentioned this briefly, but now that we're jumping into new stuff that we really get to go into. So when you take a look at the debt, now this is from at the time period. So this is in pounds of that time period in 1763, not current pounds. So I did the math of current money. Let's just say if this was exactly the same amount of pounds now, what it would convert to. You can only imagine the number that this would be in modern money, right? Like from all the years of inflation changing all over time, right? So they were in a lot of debt, and this is piling up for years after years, right? And this is bad. So now they need to make up these losses. And one of the first things they think about is they now have complete domination over the New World. And remember, they had this view that the colonists didn't really do a lot in the war, and they felt like they weren't paying their fair share in the taxes that all the British citizens were paying. Okay, and this had consumed 60% of the nation's budget. Right, these wars that were just constantly happening. So they wanted to try to make up their losses. So one of the things they do is to try to impose new taxes on the colonists to try to recover their money. Now, granted, a lot of times, usually in war, and you guys will see as we talk more about wars and probably bigger wars, is usually economies kind of spark, right? Usually the reason why is because they have a new wave of like production. But remember, this is not like the modern era, right? There's no factories. So being in war where basically a lot of the land is used for farming, a lot of the farmers are being killed off, it doesn't really help the economy go so well. Yeah.
So did all the weapons used in the war just get shipped over from England?
Yeah. They didn't really have a production in the colonies themselves. So they had basically this using the same system as before, where basically they were using the mercantilist system where all the raw materials would go to England, you then manufacture everything and then bring it back with them. So just all that combined with the lack of any sort of real production in the colonies caused a lot of issues, right? Just because it costs money to bring everything over from overseas, right? So just on top of that, the wars they were fighting, just the amount of money that they were losing was extremely bad, right? Now, on top of that, because of the fact that they added this now proclamation line and they had to enforce this law, they now needed to station troops throughout the colonies to make sure that people didn't break that rule. And that alone would cost £225,000 just to keep British troops in the colonies themselves. So now they have to pay for all the money they lost in the war and then pay for the troops to be there to protect the colonists. So they said, okay, so if we're protecting you, that means you need to pay your fair share or even more than what you did ever before. Because now we're here basically, we're your security service, right? So that's their point of view when going into this new mindset. So they start enacting new taxes in new ways. Originally, it was always on land, right? They would always usually tax you based on the land property you had owned. But now they're taxing you on consumables, right? And it's a big difference there. And you'll probably have heard this before when it comes into studying economics, but when you tax consumables, that affects literally everybody, even the lower classes of people, because they have to buy goods. When you tax land, like the more land you own, you get taxed more. They usually tax those people that are higher, richer in money, because they own more land. They have to pay more taxes on that land. But when you tax consumables, literally everyone's affected. So that's the big thing that changed, because it wasn't like they never taxed the colonists before, right? But now you're taxing goods that literally everyone uses. So everyone's feeling the brunt of this, not just the rich, but the poor as well, okay? So the first act is the Sugar Act of 1764. This one specifically had taxed foreign sugar and luxury goods, and we'll go more into that in the activity we're doing today. But the purpose of this act not only was to try to make money off of goods being sold, but it was to enforce the Navigation Acts. Because the colonists, for a certain amount of time, really since the beginning, they wanted to avoid paying taxes. They would actually get smuggled sugar from Brazil and a lot of Portuguese-owned colonies, right? Because that was their biggest. Portugal was making a lot of sugar, so they were trying to really smuggle the sugar from Portugal or even Dutch colonies, right? And the British knew about this, and they were really upset because now they're losing money on all facets, right? So they wanted to enforce the Navigation Acts to a new degree. And those people that were found smuggling were sent to these things called admiralty courts. And admiralty courts are basically, in short terms, like puppet courts, where the judge is crown appointed, right? So there's no chance that a colonist would get away free in an admiralty court because it's not a jury of their peers, all right? It's literally a court owned by the crown, and they will decide their fate based on how loyal they are to the crown itself. And those people that usually are smuggling aren't really loyal to the crown anyway. So you can always just assume that they're going to prison for as long as the crown wants them to be, okay? And this was a big deal, admiralty courts. The next one on top of that, to avoid paying that 225,000 pounds of money to keep the troops in the colonies, they enacted the Quartering Act of 1765. And this one had forced them to house British troops whenever they see fit, right? Yes, and feed them, right? So let's just say one day, you and your family sitting at the farm, and all of a sudden a crew of British troops knock on your door and say, we're staying here. That means you are forced by law to now take care of them. Even though you may not have enough food to take care of your own family, but now you have to take care of a crew of British troops and house them, right? So it causes now more resentment, especially in certain cities. So what's the question? Yeah. They didn't really care. They were saying that they deemed themselves higher than the colonists. So they said that you will provide any good you have, any resource you have, to our troops instead of yourselves, because it's almost like they are entitled to that better treatment. Now, when you look at even the Bill of Rights, right? The Third Amendment was solely made because of the Quartering Act, right? They wanted to make sure that no one is forced to have to take care of troops. Now, that doesn't happen nowadays, right? Because, I mean, it was kind of crazy when you first look at the Bill of Rights. You see all these different amendments that are basically tied to like really important aspects of our rights. And all of a sudden the Third Amendment comes in, and you're like, really? You're going to make an amendment on that you're not forced to have troops in your house, right? If you don't want to? Like, yeah, but because that was a big deal at the time. Because they didn't have enough resources to take care of themselves, now let alone take care of troops. And this becomes a bigger deal when it comes to times of rebellion, right? Because now in Boston, in certain cities that are more against the crown, you start seeing more troops sent there. And we'll talk about that probably in a few slides. But you're only going to start seeing more acts being placed. And there's a trend that you see here. The first act is 1764. A lot of people were annoyed about it. So they start to kind of protest. They start to kind of argue with the crown. The crown says, okay, we'll rescind that act. And then the next year they put a new one in. And it's the same trend that starts to happen every year. So the first one was 1764. Quartering Act was 1765. This one's the same year, but at the end of the year, the Stamp Act. And the reason why the Stamp Act is now seen to be more of a big deal is because now it's basically putting a revenue stamp where you have to pay a tax for every stamp you own on almost all written documents. Now, the Sugar Act was almost an attack on merchants, okay? Because they were the ones that were subverting the Navigation Acts. They were the ones that are selling illegal sugar, right, to the British or even to other groups. And this was only attacking the merchants. The Stamp Act is now attacking everybody. Because literally, documents that are being used to have that revenue stamp is everything. Most illegal documents, newspapers, pamphlets, playing cards, advertisements, letters. Everything that is a written document sent through either the mail or sold has to have this revenue stamp attached to it, right? So that means everyone is now being forced to pay this specific tax, which is it's a big deal, especially written documents like a pamphlet, right? Just something with information on it sent to somebody else, a newspaper, right? And the reason why the British had forced this is because in the colonies, a revolution of of written material or newspapers are being flushed throughout the colonies, right? They want to now expand their information, expand what the average person can write about in the colonies, and this was spreading all throughout the East Coast. So they knew that a lot of people are using these types of documents, so they're going to tax it so that they get money every single time someone uses something. Okay. Now there were many protests to these different acts. It caused a lot of issues, right? And the basic premise that every person would say, and I apologize for the small written language, but I'll highlight what it's saying, right? Is the same basic premise of no taxation without representation, right? Ben Franklin was one of the first people to say that. The idea that they don't have representation within Parliament, and based on English law, they should not be taxed if they do not have a say in those taxes being imposed on them, okay? Now, Parliament's response to Ben Franklin and a lot of other colonists as well is you have what they call virtual representation. And virtual representation basically means that you guys have an ability to do the right thing when it comes to trading, right? You don't have to subvert the Navigation Acts. You have the right to sell your goods at generally most of the prices you want to sell them at. So you have virtual representation. You may not have say on laws, but you have your own rights when it comes to certain aspects of society. So they're saying you have virtual representation. It's not real representation. It's just saying kind of represented. Not really that much, right? And you see a lot more people from Virginia, people from Pennsylvania, people from Massachusetts. They're all saying the same thing, that they should be represented in Parliament if you're going to tax them, okay? Now, what James Otis of Massachusetts, and you're going to notice Massachusetts is going to be probably the biggest pusher of really pushing back against the crown. They want to have a Stamp Act Congress, right? And Stamp Act Congress is basically they send delegates from 9 separate colonies to try to come up with a kind of like a declaration to say that they have the right to decide what taxes are for their own colonies, right? Which is a complete defiant act against the crown. And then you start to see a spark of even subgroups that our sole purpose is to basically annoy the crown as much as possible. And one of those groups starts out as the Sons of Liberty. And the Daughters of Liberty also get involved later on. So that's why I usually tag them together as Sons and Daughters of Liberty, right? And their sole goal, like I mentioned, is to annoy the crown and to basically subvert the taxes that are being imposed on them, right? Now, this was seen as a radical group at the time. It was led by Sam Adams, Paul Revere. These are some other characters within the colonies that we'll learn more about. But Sam Adams is probably the most vocal one of them all. Okay, the cousin of John Adams. And we'll watch some clips with Sam. It's very really well done TV series. John Adams. We'll watch, and you'll see Sam Adams in there as well. And to kind of cause some issues is that all the customs officers or even the tax collectors, the Sons and Daughters of Liberty, would tar and feather people. Now, does anyone know what tar and feathering is? Yes. It's extremely painful because they use hot tar, not like just like coal tar and put it on and put feathers on. Hot tar, like they would literally boil it, pour it on the person. It literally burned their skin completely. Then they would throw feathers on them to make them look like a chicken, right? That's basically the whole process of it. And tar is what they used for the streets at the time. Not like streets nowadays, but tar was used for other products as well. So they would pour tar on the person, put feathers on them, and this would cause a lot of issues, and it would anger the crown heavily. So what their response is, the colonists, was to boycott all British goods. And this was a big blow to the British. Because remember, the whole idea of mercantilism was that the colonists would buy the manufactured goods from England, right, and send over the raw materials. So if they're not getting that influx of money, this is going to be a big deal. So the British kind of, they get rid of the current prime minister, which was Grenville, and they say that he had failed with keeping peace within the colonies while increasing the revenue that he was solely purposed to do, right? Now, this gave the colonists a slight victory, but then Parliament would then enact what they call the Declaratory Act, which is basically saying, we have complete right over to tax anything that we desire, and you must abide by it. And this was a response to the Stamp Act Congress that was formed by the colonies, right? That it said that they had the complete right, and then Parliament says, no, we have the complete right to basically enact any sort of tax upon you, all right? And this is going to cause more issues down the line, just to kind of give you a sense there. All right. This will be the last tax we talk about before we jump into the worksheet, all right? The worksheet's going to cover the 4 major taxes, and then we'll see the reactions from the colonists and how they feel towards them. But the last one we'll talk about today is really going to focus on Charles Townshend, known as the Townshend Acts, right? Now, Charles Townshend basically was the executor of the Treasury for Britain. Because at the time, they replaced Grenville with William Pitt to be the prime minister. But William Pitt was really sick at the time, so he couldn't really fulfill his duties. So they ended up putting Townshend as the main person that's now enacting taxes in the colonies. And what the Townshend Acts of 1767 had done was it put taxes on teas, glass, and paper. And a lot of these times, these were used to pay for colonial appointments of like royal governors. So it was almost like the colonists are paying for the governor's salaries that they didn't select. And this was a big deal because if they were voting for their governors, then I think it would have been a lot easier. But remember, as I mentioned, we probably talked about before, multiple or majority of the governors of the colonies were not voted on by the people. They were chosen by the crown, right? So this was a direct violation of what the colonists deemed to be right to them, right? Especially with the whole idea of no taxation without representation, right? Now, what ends up happening is the Sons of Liberty gain more popularity, and they start really pushing the limit on hurting tax collectors, resisting the government as much as possible, and to the point where we even start to see assemblies of colonies kind of reject their taxes entirely. For instance, New York, their assembly, had resisted and said, you guys are wrong for this, and they were suspended by the royal crown, as in they lost their power because they had resisted the crown's taxes. What happens also is the British impose a new process of searching homes, which is known as right of assistance, right? Where now they have the right to search your home without a warrant, which is kind of leads into all the things the Bill of Rights talk about. The fact that you need to have a warrant to search someone's home. This was not happening with the British troops because now they're trying to find either smuggled goods or really find anything that would hurt the colonists that were openly against the crown, right? So from here, let's jump into the worksheet that I posted for you guys today. It's the British imposed taxes worksheet. Okay, it should look like this. Okay, so this is going to be there. You guys will have 2 days to get this done. We'll do most of it today in class, and I'll just give you the basic premise of what it looks like. So we'll be getting to groups like we normally do. At the very top, there's going to be a nice little graphic organizer that goes over the 4 major acts or taxes that we'll be talking about. The first column is going to be just talking about generally what is being taxed. Right, so when you work with your groups, you just need to find one of the documents will talk about specifics of the tax, and then the second one is going to be focused on the reactions from the colonists themselves. Right, so there are obviously there's 4 pairs of documents. So for each act, I have 2 documents per act. Right, one of them is going to focus a lot about the details. The other one's going to be focused on the reactions because of that. All right, so what I want you guys to do is get into groups. Right, you can get into groups of 3, 2. I mean, obviously we only have 8, so be 2 groups of 3 and 1 group of 2. So let's get into those now. So what might be able to help you out is if you break down the documents or break down the acts into certain people, and you can then tackle this a lot quicker, okay? So you just separate which group member will do a specific act. That'll make your life easier, all right?